if you find someone whose taste you really respect, and that person is out there kind of producing work, producing essays, producing reviews that is curating a certain artistic world for other people, then follow them and pay attention to what they're curating. I always tell, younger writers or people who are embarking on this journey that finding a program or a community or a group or a collaborative can be really life-changing.
Welcome to Shelf Therapy, the podcast where literature meets inspiration. We are passionate about bringing the magic of books to the young readers, especially in Indonesia. In each episode, we dive into conversations about books and how it can profoundly impact your lives, and in hopes can help you navigate yours. We would really appreciate your support by subscribing to this channel. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please leave us your feedback so that we can grow together. This season, we are shooting at the comfort of Bumi Kinar's library in Ubud, so I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude for them for lending us their beautiful space. I hope that you enjoy the podcast. Aubrey Lescure is a French-Chinese-American writer. Her debut novel, River East, River West, was published by William Morrow, HarperCollins in the US, and Duckworth Books in the UK in January 2024, and was actually shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Her essay, At the Bend of the Road, was selected for Best American Essays in 2022. An excerpt from her forthcoming novel was a semifinalist in the Boston Review's 2022 Aura Estrada Short Story Contest, and her short fiction was a finalist for Bomb Magazine's 2021 Fiction Contest, judged by Otessa, I'm sorry if I butcher this, Moshfegh. Currently, she works as the deputy editor at Off Assignment. Hi, Ob. It's so great to see you here in Bali. Is it your first time here?
It's actually my first time in Ubud. I came to Bali once when I was 16 years old with my mom, and we just went to a hotel. So I feel like that barely counts because we didn't really see much of the island. But this time I'm staying for 2 whole weeks.
Oh, wow.
So I'm excited.
So you get to spend time here and also even read
in
Ubud.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. I'm excited to talk more about books, particularly your book, becoming a novelist for the first time. But before that, I would like to get to know you better. Maybe we can talk about your background and also your relationship with literature as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm half French and half Chinese. My mom is French, my dad is Chinese, but I was born in the United States, although I never grew up there, but I live there currently since as a writer, this is my only way to stay in that country without having to fight for a visa is a good luck of a citizenship from birth. But my upbringing was really in China for the most part, and also with frequent trips to France. So I really do feel connected with both countries and both sides of my family. And later on, for 2 years of boarding school and college onwards, I've been in America on the East Coast. And you ask about my relationship to literature and books growing up. I think like many writers who you probably talk to, they were the biggest part of my childhood. I would say that, and growing up in China, my mom and I had a lot of access to DVDs and movies and TV shows that were just kind of out there in abundance. So through both books and I would say kind of visual storytelling, I think of my childhood often as a binge of material. Like I would be, reading like one book a day that we got at the secondhand foreign bookstore in Shanghai. And then we would get like 3 DVDs from a guy on the street and I would watch like 3 movies on the school night. And then of course studies, got busier and I had less time, but I think this kind of abundance of material, of stories to consume that I had access to. And I had a pretty free and wild childhood. Like my mom was a single mom and would just she would be at work and I would be at home, watching my 3 movies and doing my homework on the side. And I think that's where I first developed my love as a consumer for literature and cinema. But I didn't see it as a plausible career path until I left university and really questioned, what is a job, a career that is the top of my list for I actually love doing this, I enjoy doing this. I am not just clocking in time and clocking out at an office, which I was doing at the time, working at a think tank. And the answer was literature. And that's when I decided to take the leap and become a freelance writer. And I've never worked an office job since, but I think it took quite a few years for me to realize that the perceived lack of safety in writing was a risk I was willing to take.
Wow, that's so interesting. Do you think your consumption of literature and media or movies have changed since then? Or, because we're living in a world where we're always constantly binging on things, on content, on social media, on messages, on text, articles, imagery, everything. How do you think that relationship has developed throughout the years, maybe?
That's such an interesting question. And I would say in my childhood, I was probably consuming, ironically, higher quality content at these high volumes than nowadays in the era of reality TV and Netflix.
Right.
Like, I love to watch reality TV with my housemates, but I feel like there's more of this model of these kind of mass-produced 20-episode shows that are available to stream instantly. Whereas when I look back on my childhood, it was a more esoteric diet of media because, I would be watching like historical war movies about World War II, and I had, a whole phase of those, or whatever I could get my hands on at the second bookstore, which growing up in China, kind of what was there, what we had access to, also felt it just depended on what was let in a particular year or what books someone discarded and decided to sell to the bookstore. And I oftentimes now at age 31, when, I turn on a screen, whether it's my computer or my TV, to make a decision to watch things, I do try to be more conscious of some nights you just want to fall into like a 4-hour, to reality TV watching sessions. But sometimes I remember I haven't watched movies on my own personal home screen for so long. I think we just oftentimes just default to TV series, and movies don't need to just, be safe for the cinema. And I've really once for a few years where I was barely watching any movies, only TV shows. And I think that's probably a more kind of, late 2010s, 2020s, like streaming services on our laptops brought that on.
Yeah, I feel like I've lost the ability to, at home at least, fully focus on watching a whole movie without pausing it or checking my phone. I really need to go to the cinema and put my phone away to focus on a movie now. But also I feel like yes, in a way, the content was more high quality back then because we were reading real books, while now it could be just, I was also talking about this with Bora Chung, that we are consuming fragments of content on a daily basis, whether it's reading a caption or receiving a text message. It's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So it's quite interesting and confusing. I mean, I'm curious to see how it will be in the future, and also how I'm looking forward to see sci-fi novels, for example, that are written today about the future, because we don't know where the world is going. Anyway, were you reading books in Chinese or?
Yes, actually, my early years. So I grew up with Chinese and French as my maternal languages, and I didn't learn English until I was, a school kid.
Right.
I was going through the Chinese public school system. So a lot of my earliest books were all French and Chinese, because those were the only languages I spoke. And it's interesting to think back now, because a lot of the Chinese books I read were like abridged version of world classics that were translated into Chinese and really kind of condensed and simplified. And so, I was a kid, so I was probably not appreciating the half of it already. But when I think back to, a lot of Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters, or, someone will say something about those books, and I realize that I miss basically half the plot because I was literally reading a version that was, a third of its original length.
Right.
And then
I forget the plot.
Yeah.
Can't remember.
Yeah, exactly. And it was I actually really hated learning English in school as a child. I was not good at it particularly until I think I turned 10 or 11, and I finally reached the level of English as, a later acquired language where I could start reading books. And I was reading these really trashy novels. Like at the secondhand bookstore I mentioned, there were a lot of Jackie Collins. I don't know if you
no.
Have you heard of, but she wrote a lot about her. She had a whole series called Hollywood Kids, Hollywood Wives, Hollywood Husbands. And it was all about, the kind of glamour and gossip of that world. And I was reading that at, 11 or 12. And it was kind of way too graphic and adult. But I was like, oh, knowing a language can actually, give you access to dive into this world that feels really forbidden. Yeah, and actually now that I'm saying this, I think in my own novel, my protagonist is a 14-year-old girl, Alba, living in Shanghai, and she's kind of escaping or accessing these worlds beyond China that she feels are inaccessible to her through binge watching a lot of TV, namely a lot of this more pulpy, trashy TV that gives her a sense of what's outside, but of course it's a very skewed sense. And that's not, really what the real world is like, but that's what she envisions it to be through her media diet.
Right. Even reality TV is not real.
Yeah.
So I'm also interested in sort of how you feel with your identity. Have you ever felt struggle of being accepted, or the need to identify what am I? Because I also, as a mixed race, sometimes feel like I'm in Australia. I'm not Australian. I don't feel Australian at all. But I'm also in Bali. I'm not fully a local. So did you have those experiences growing up? And did you confide into reading books to sort of help you with that, navigate your, background?
Yeah, I think certainly to a certain extent, they were a way for me to kind of channel was part of my identity that felt like growing up in China, it was what we were able to consume in school, or like censorship was a very real phenomenon. And
it still is.
It still is. It's, you know, just as strict as before. And at the same time, you have basically this black market, this internet world where you can like basically buy pirated versions of older books and DVDs you don't really have access to. And this is a big theme in my novel too. It's like free movement or free access, or, you know, that's something that the narrator in my book and me as a kid, I had more of that than my Chinese classmates who maybe for citizenship, visa, like actual paperwork reasons, it was literally like true that it was harder for them to access, you know, trips to other countries, like studies abroad in ways that because I had a foreign passport, it was easier for me to do so. And I think growing up in China, going through a Chinese public school system, and I look more Chinese when I was a kid, so I could pass more. And growing up was a process of realizing that not only did I grow up to look more and more not Chinese, more Western, and I started going to, you know, international schools when I was a teenager, and then eventually moving abroad for my studies, which placed me, you know, in the Western world. But then also looking back in hindsight, and I think the book, you know, the novel Reckons was a lot of that. I always have what you would now call passport privilege. I mean, back then it wouldn't have been a term, but there was always access that existed for me that didn't, you know, exist for my classmates and my friends. And that's something that I'm a lot more conscious about. And I just came back from 3 weeks in Shanghai where I was with my Chinese family. And now it's almost like returning there is a very kind of strange experience, as a lot of, you know, I think returnees to their home countries and hometowns feel. It's like you are not necessarily fully westernized, but you are certainly squarely no longer part of the same world and upbringing where your family and friends maybe still are in. And there's almost this sense of this mix of nostalgia and affection, but also disconnect.
Let's talk a little bit more about your debut novel. I feel like, you know, growing up with all this identity crisis or not knowing where I belong, there wasn't that many books written by or written about these topics as I feel like there are now. One of my books that I really like, one of my favorite is Small Bodies of Water, written by Nina Minya Powell. And I actually did an interview with her as well. And I like how she talks about her, you know, identity being, I believe she's Chinese and grew up in New Zealand, but Chinese Malay. So there's a lot going on there. And I just find comfort reading something like that, knowing that I'm not the only one. So that was really nice. And do you want to talk about your book a little bit and explain without spoilers?
Yeah, sure. So the book is mainly following a 14-year-old girl called Alva, who was born and raised in Shanghai. She is half American and half Chinese. So she lives with her single mom, who's an American woman, but she has gone to Chinese public schools her whole life. Her mom is kind of like a lifelong expat to China, and they have this pretty freewheeling partnership and relationship. And then at the beginning of the book, seemingly out of nowhere, the mom marries their Chinese landlord, a middle-aged Chinese businessman called Lu Fang. And this, of course, is devastating for the teenage Alva to suddenly have to move in with a stranger and basically share her mother. But he is a very wealthy Chinese businessman. And one thing she and her mother lacked were financial resources. And so suddenly she sees this opportunity to maybe use him to get access to the Shanghai American school and maybe even going abroad, because she has this quite unhealthy relationship, I would say, was fantasizing about the West and wanted to see what's beyond the city and country of her childhood. So the book is also in part narrated by Lu Feng, the Chinese stepfather, and his timeline take us back to the 1980s when China had just recently opened up again after the Cultural Revolution. And he's a married clerk at a shipyard in a small northern Chinese city. And he meets an American woman who's part of the first waves of foreigners who have been allowed into China. And as you may guess, the two timelines kind of complement mysteries and gaps in, the two sets of plots, and they converge to the present day, to the family unit.
How did you get the idea for this book? How does it feel like writing your first novel? What was it also based on your experience? Or tell us more about how you came about this novel.
So it is definitely a highly, highly, highly autobiographical novel. That's really how it started. At some point, the first drafts, the first manuscripts were just kind of memory dumps of my childhood and my observations and my recollections, with like the most thin layer of fiction and plot on top of it. But really, my life wasn't interesting enough to write a memoir, so there was no cohesive overall storyline. And in the process of revising the book and working on it over the course of 4 or 5 years, I added in Lu Feng, the Chinese stepfather, as a secondary narrator. I started thinking a lot more about, what makes a novel, characters actually being characters and not just stand-ins for a vague kind of plotless stream of consciousness style of narration. Although those kind of plotless novels are my favorite to read.
Yeah.
But in writing one, I kind of grew to use the tools of fiction to make it a tighter, more forward-moving book. And in that, I made plot decisions that were not at all autobiographical, or that didn't have anything to do with my real life, didn't happen to me or people I knew, but still I care about, the social truth of things too, not to even speak about the emotional truth of things. But when bad things or dramatic things happen to my characters, I almost had this instinct of, oh, that's too dramatic. That's like a cheap movie plot point. But then I would think, is this thing happening because there's a larger societal trend or phenomenon or truth that this is in fact happening to people? Like, I have characters in my book who, get into very tragic or unhealthy or dangerous circumstances. And that did happen to youth who are growing up in China. So I think because I actually primarily come from an essayist and nonfiction writer background, I really chose the subject matter of this book first because it's just a material I knew, and I wasn't trying to make anything up, and making things up felt like soap opera like or too dramatic for me. And then I started becoming a novelist and thinking, no, it actually makes for a better story, and it can help the reader access these social or emotional truths more powerfully if you embrace the tools of fiction.
How did you find that transition between being an essayist into a novelist? Was it just like seamless, or were you like doubting yourself? Was there pressure to, okay, I'm writing a novel now?
I think I came first from the idea of wanting to write a book length work. Like, I wanted to write a book, and it wasn't like I wanted to write a novel and I had to write a novel. But as I just said, I I felt like, no, it would be pretentious to write a memoir. You know, I was in my mid-20s. Like, I have some interesting kind of background, upbringing, observations and thoughts about living in China and in Shanghai and observing the dynamics between, you know, the expat community and their attitudes towards the Chinese society around them. But it would be kind of preposterous to write a nonfiction book about it. But I want to write a book. So my only option is really to make this a novel. And it wasn't seamless at all in the sense that I was generating all these material that had huge problems with pacing and character motivation because they were essentially description based rather than character based. And I think that was one of my greatest challenges personally going from nonfiction to fiction is I could describe things forever. Like I love nature writing. I love place writing. I love travel writing because, you know, the descriptiveness of it is almost parts of its soul more than anything else. You're not really necessarily expecting plot out of nature writing. But that's very different for novel and novel readers. So needing to kind of hack away at this like massive amount of writing that felt very diffuse and descriptive and infuse forward momentum and character motivation and plot and cause and consequence and all of those things. That's why books take years to write.
There's so much to think about. Does it change your relationship to reading after writing a novel in a way? Yeah,
definitely. I think, well, you know, first there's probably the very obvious observation that a lot of writers might give you is that you come to a book with the eyes of a writer and you're more attuned to the craft and the mechanics of how someone else structured their book. You know, what are the writerly decisions they are making? And there's definitely, you know, what can I learn from what they're doing well or not well? Like I really don't like writing dialogue, and I always feel like I have to force myself to write a lot of dialogue in my book. And then I'll read a book that I love and I'll look at it and be like, there's barely any dialogue here. I bet this writer also doesn't like writing dialogue, and they just get away with writing a great book with barely any. Maybe that's something I can do as well. Like I don't need to force myself to lean into a dimension that I'm not good at or I don't enjoy. But I think the other thing that I'm thinking a lot about these days is the books I enjoy reading are not necessarily the ones I'm going to be able to write, not just from, you know, a vast gap in talent and ability kind of perspective, but even in style. So the books I love the most are often very quiet, plotless books that are very observant, and they're about the texture and the minutia of life in a way that's very delicate and musical and evocative. And part of me always thought, if that's what I love, that's also what I'm going to write. But in fact, I'm working on my second novel now. And for both book 1 and book 2, that's just not what I'm putting down on the page. Like I am writing novels with more plots and more concepts and less of that just kind of exquisite, you know, texture of daily life. And part of me is wondering, you know, if I love those kind of books so much, maybe one day, maybe for my 3rd or 4th or 5th book, that is what I will write. But it's interesting that admiration and emulation don't necessarily come hand in hand, that what I like to read isn't necessarily what I'm going to turn around and try to write.
Right. So what is it that you like to read?
So just to name a few recent favorite books that I think really are about the quiet texture of life. There's one called The Anthropologist by Ayşegül Chavez. And it's about this couple living in this unnamed city that I have a strong sense is Paris, but that's neither confirmed nor denied.
I love Paris.
Yes. But you never is a street name or a cafe name or a city name mentioned, but you can you can get from just the sense of the details of the city. Maybe everyone has a private theory of what that city is, but it's really just about this young couple's daily life and rituals. And really, that's all there is to the plot.
But I guess, like, if you name the location, it also limits a writer to explore that location within their imagination, if that makes sense.
It's so true that this definitely must have been a very conscious decision on the part of the writer to kind of, how can something be so detailed and so textural and yet avoid naming a single street name or restaurant name or location name that will give the city away. And I do think it becomes a canvas that is not blank at all, but it's almost like a thinly painted watercolor canvas where there is this beautiful kind of image emerging, but the reader can project whatever the city, in their head is onto that canvas.
Yeah, it could even be something else for someone else. And also maybe because the writer may not come from that city. So it's sort of something that, okay, I'm not familiar enough. I'm not a local. So maybe it's best if I just write it according to my take on it. Yeah. But you are from Shanghai. I mean, you grew up in Shanghai and you wrote about Shanghai in your book. Did you ever think that, or have some sort of fear that you're not, giving the city justice in terms of writing about it?
Yeah, that's definitely always, I mean, as a writer, there's no end to the anxiety and fear about not doing enough justice for a variety of things. But yeah, a real world setting, it's interesting you bring that up, because in my book, I mean, it's really all about Shanghai. It's really like, it's not a blank canvas. Like, it's about, I would say I cared a lot about the accuracy of not only the place details, but the kind of social and racial dynamics of the city at the particular time when I was portraying it. I think a way to think about, where do I stand? What is my lens to make these observations is being fairly honest about, I think if you're a reader reading my novel, it's Shanghai seen through the eyes of a girl who loves the city and has grown up there, but has always experienced it a little bit differently from others around her, because she has on the facade this life where she was born and raised here, goes through the Chinese public school system, but she has a white woman living back at home who's like her only family and the only person she knows, and she has an American passport. And that makes her experience of the city so different from anyone else's. And it is a lot about also her straddling these two worlds of, later on she goes to international school and she's more fully immersed in the expat community and expatriate society that also exists in Shanghai. But she's not quite fully, absolutely not like a Chinese school child who has to go to Chinese public school. She knows that's her life in some ways, but she has an out. She could go to international school if she could afford it because she has a foreign passport. But once she goes to international school, at some point in the book, she does get her way. She then becomes very shocked and dismayed at a lot of the attitudes or behaviors of the expat teenagers or expat families around her in a way that really make, I would say, that the Chinese or Shanghainese part of her feel insulted, because she is seeing a lot of the condescension or indifference or neo-colonial attitudes and lifestyles that the expats have. So this thing she had been idolizing up till this point, this Western lifestyle, she now sees, what if in Shanghai it's built upon the sense of superiority over local Chinese or Shanghainese people that up to this point, that was a life she knew more of. But I think I think what I really try to steer clear of in my fiction writing and my nonfiction writing is the sense that this voice or this account is representative of a whole, or it's giving you the most authentic, the true, the da-da-da. It's like, no, it's always going to be from this hyper-specific lens. That, of course, is just one very personal, very narrow, view of the city. But I will get as textural and detailed as possible there to make it feel very granular and real. But, that granularity doesn't necessarily represent the scope of speaking for a city or the impossible burden of representing a whole city through your writing.
But even I am not very familiar with Shanghai and how things are there. I resonate with this because being half Asian, half kind of European as well, I saw also that the lens of how there's this white superiority. But after a while, I appreciate more of the Eastern culture and how actually we're amazing, learning about it. It's just, it grows. So when you're writing, are you really writing for yourself? Is there an element of I want to share my story, or are you thinking about your audience more? I'm just curious with also your process of as a writer.
Yeah, I think with this novel, at least first I was writing for myself, just in the sense of getting the raw draft out, getting the raw story out. And then the audience comes in, not necessarily in terms of, what information should I leave in or leave out because it will be interesting or not interesting to a particular audience or particular subset. I think for me, it's kind of symbiotic. Like, what makes a novel good as a work of literature, like not having sloppy plot or really bad pacing or half-baked kind of storylines that don't really go anywhere or really flat characters, that thinking about the audience gave me a kick in the butt in terms of really reinforcing those. It's like, if I'm only writing this for myself as a loose word document, then maybe, I don't need a plot. I don't need to care about pacing. I'm personally, as a reader, very good with like being really patient with really lengthy, meandering descriptions. But when I thought about readers for my book, I was like, no, there's, I gotta work on the pacing, and it's like no one should be presumed to have endless patience wading through, like a 5-page description of this, even though I think I have more patience as a reader for that, but that can often become an excuse, I would say, of writers being self-indulgent, is when you're like, oh, but that's what I like as a reader, or I indulge in this as a reader. So surely when I do this, readers can also indulge me. But I think I try to be pretty tough with myself and just, use the idea of an audience to really, really sharpen the story elements of the book. But it doesn't really come into play when I think about themes or content. Like, I don't want to censure a particular, part of the story or content or discussion because I think, such and such audience, like, they won't like it if we talk about this too much or that too much. That's when I try to leave the audience out of it. Because when you're thinking too much about, is this acceptable? Is this offensive? Is this going to be, palatable to so-and-so? Then in the end, I think you're left with a lot of anxiety and paralysis.
Yeah, it may not even happen because you're just like questioning all the time. Did you have sort of a writing mentor or someone to guide you with your first novel, whether it's an agent or a publisher?
I am very, very grateful for this one writing program that I did. It's a writing organization in Boston called Grub Street. And they offer a lot of different classes. And one of them was this year-long intensive novel revision program. And I think I felt essentially alone until I joined that program, because I did not study English or literature in my undergraduate studies, and I never pursued any graduate studies in writing, and none of my friends from school were writers.
Right.
So I was just kind of churning out these attempts at writing on my own. You know, my friends and family were supportive, but that was not their career. They could only understand it to some extent. I applied into that program. Was a rough first draft of my manuscript. And then through a year, I made 9 other friends and colleagues and peers who became some of the most important friends in my life and who still are. And throughout the year, we read each other's novels and revisions and new material several times over. The workload was incredible, but thanks to the structure, discipline, accountability, community that program provided, I emerged from it having a community of 9 other people who had just gone through exactly what I had gone through. And they wanted the same things I wanted. And then from there on, I started searching for agents and editors. But, you know, I felt solidified by having this group of people who I found. So that's why I always tell, you know, younger writers or people who are embarking on this journey that finding a program or a community or a group or a collaborative can be really life-changing. And a lot of people are like, I don't know if a writing group is for me, or going to school to get a degree is too
intimidated.
much. Yeah. But I would say there's all shapes and forms of it. Like mine, it was not a degree program. It was only 1 year. It felt doable. It was in my local city.
Yeah. Could be a life-changing moment.
Yeah.
I mean, even the festival has master classes in whether it's writing a novel, a comic book, a zine, those types of things could just, you know, help you get started. But did you have maybe a writer that you looked up to as a young adult, or even now that you've, you know, released your first novel or a book even?
So Garth Greenwell, I think, is one of the stylists as a novelist that I look up to the most, but he's also an incredible teacher. And I have never studied formally with him, but he does do online classes sometimes. And I did take a couple of his online workshops on writing sex scenes, actually.
Oh, wow.
Where, I mean, it's like the most like intellectual, spiritual, literary approach to writing sex that you could imagine taking.
See,
these
I
classes.
didn't even know that was a thing that people offered. I didn't know you could actually specifically go to a workshop about a specific thing.
It's the beauty of the internet nowadays. I mean, it happens in person at festivals like this. You know, you'll get like seminars about very specific topics, but you can, through, you know, various online agencies or organizations, take these classes where I, again, like met a community of people that was very much like my year-long novel workshop. I'm still in touch with them when I go to different cities. We go to book events together. But Garth Greenwell taught that class, and I kind of followed his work more from then. And he writes a lot of essays, and he has a Substack where he's really a curator of taste. I feel like what I realized early on is his taste really is inspiring to me and aligns with what I find aesthetically and emotionally beautiful in books and movies. And then after I followed his work as kind of a thinker, a reviewer, a critic, a writer, I have discovered through his work and through his essays and through his interviews, other books, texts, movies that I also love very deeply that I otherwise wouldn't have discovered. And that makes me think a lot, you know, not necessarily as an advice, but just observation to everyone out there. If you have a writer or a curator of sorts who, you know how we follow social media influencers and we're like, oh, like we follow this account because I like the clothes she wears or the places she travels to or, you know, like the things she eats. I think in a very literary way, you know, maybe it doesn't take the form of social media posts, but if you find someone whose taste you really respect, and that person is out there kind of producing work, producing essays, producing reviews that is curating a certain artistic world for other people, then like follow them and pay attention to what they're curating. Right. And I think a lot about me in my longer career as a writer. I think one of the faux pas or the easy traps to fall into when your first book comes out is you're like promo, me, like my book. And like, that's all your social media posts. But over the long run, becoming someone who can also curate and uplift other pieces of art and writers who you like and someone who likes your work and your taste might also discover through you. I think that's what I follow him for in part. And that's what I would hope to be in the future is, you know, start talking more about the things that I love. Because if someone loves what I love, then there's this whole kind of symbiotic cycle of curation and discovery that is happening.
I see. Yeah, always follow what you love. But since you mentioned about promo and sort of, I guess, more of the business side of being a writer, because we still need to make money to create and produce and live. I also had this conversation with Bora earlier about sort of the business side to it and how her publicist or agent also had sort of a business plan for her short essays that turned into her book, Curse Bunny. So I would like to know your experience, you know, in terms of writing and books as a business.
Yeah, that's actually, that's really been on my mind this year because my first novel came out in January of 2024. And up to that point, I would say I'm a writer who didn't think about business at all. And in fact, the naive, younger 2023 version of me told myself, I will not become one of those writers who cares about sales and who cares about publicity. And I'm quite introverted as a person. And I thought, you know, it's great that people think writers are hermits because then it'll just be normal if I don't get out there, if I don't, you know, like work my butt off to do promo and publicity, then it's fine because writers are hermits anyways. And I'm not going to let the business side of things cannibalize me or, you know, distress me. But it's so hard to avoid the closer and closer and closer you inch your publication date. I found myself really, I think, unprepared for it. And that's why it got me in an unhealthy way, right? I think if you're someone who is, you know, maybe a team, a community, or more coming from a different set of experiences where you're more prepared, I think you can navigate the business of publishing without letting it kind of take over your brain. But I went from this fantasy of like, I'm going to not care about this and be a hermit, and to
the reality comes.
The reality of publication day comes around and you're like, what lists am I on or not on? Did this get picked by a book club? Did this get da-da-da? Oh, suddenly I realize it's impossible to not care about sales or publicity or the success of your book. Suddenly, these expectations that you thought you could really keep a handle on are coming out like these, you know, green eye monsters of envy and competitiveness. And then you're in the thick of the publication where it's like, could I be doing more? Could I be doing more publicity? Could I be like, is there a way for me to reach more audiences? And you realize, as a writer, there's a ton of work that you have to do if, you know, you do want to get your book out there and for things to go well. I mean, there's some books that are very lucky to be kind of the breakouts of their season where there's a lot of just organic traction. But what I learned is, there's also a lot of actual work in the business of being a writer and being like almost like a salesperson, a representative, a PR rep for your own self and your own book. And I kind of learned all of this on the fly after my book came out, while trying to manage this disconnect between my naivete and my expectations. And now that we are 9 months out from publication, I finally ramp back down to, I enjoy doing interviews and events and book clubs now, because it's every so often, it's always pleasurable to do, but it doesn't feel like this like huge, like dangling sword over your head of, if you don't do this, you're not doing enough for your baby, which is this book.
Yeah.
And now it feels like, okay, these can kind of come in, roll in as opportunities, but I'm going back to writing. I'm working, on essays. I'm working on my next book, and I can start not necessarily forgetting about the business of being a writer, but going back from business writer to writer. Yeah. Although now I think I will always remember what that experience felt like. And as I continue my career, when future books come out, it's almost like being through that initiation of like, you think you're going to not care. You think you're going to rise above the business of it and the sales and publicity of it and the competitiveness of it. But unless you're really, really mentally and spiritually strong, it's hard not to care.
You can only take it one step at a time. Yeah. So you
learn.
You finished your novel, and then you've experienced the whole promo side to it, and then now on to the next. But hopefully all this won't take away, the reason why you want to write and make it your career. So that's so interesting. I was talking to Bora earlier, and the reason why she started writing short essays was because she wanted the prize money. She wanted the prize money, and it's so important to find a publisher that can, take your work out there and sort of let other people who are almost experts at business to rework your work a little bit.
Yeah.
And I see how she's, I guess, has a sense of detachment almost to her work, that she's like, okay, whatever works, but I'm going to continue to write. I'm going to continue to create, which is what I'm sure you also want to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think a lot about things like book covers. I feel like that's such a decision that it's almost like, as a writer, at some point you're just like, sure, the publishing house is going to want the cover that sells the most books, right? And like, it's lucky if it's a cover that I like and we are aligned on. And I was quite lucky that I do quite like.
So how was that
covers.
Process for you for the book cover? Did you get to decide sort of the design, or?
Yeah, they send you, it's very exciting when it happens. The publishing house sends you a few mock-ups that sometimes are like very different directions, and you kind of consult on, which one you like best, if you have a clear preference. But then at some point, I feel like it's, especially as a debut novelist, it wasn't like I had like veto or decision power if I really like, you're more there as like a consulting voice, and then you can get overridden. But that's when I really felt like covers are what sell books. And there's a whole business. There's like market analytics. And like, you remember the year where every book cover was like a collage of like really colorful like fragments, and
I'm definitely guilty of judging a book by its cover. I can't help myself. When I go to a bookstore, it's like a candy store, and then you get attracted to the beautiful book covers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But when you're writing a book, you're not really thinking about the book cover or the sell side of things, but there are so many decisions like this in the post, manuscript process where it's like, okay, gotta let the experts do their jobs. And sure, it would be nice to make some money if sales are good. So you are going to, hand some of those things over. But I think I was lucky that in terms of my actual manuscript, I didn't need to make decisions that felt like hyper pertinent to the text itself. That felt like there was like pressure to change things in order to boost sales or make it more palatable to broader audiences. That's when it gets really tricky as a writer.
Yeah.
And I think with this book, it's just about having great editors whose vision align with yours. And, you get this question a lot as a writer. It's like, did they make you change anything you really didn't want to change in the book itself? And I'm, I was lucky to be like, no, that really wasn't. My editors basically told me the pacing is really off because there's 5 pages of descriptions here and there. Go fix that.
Okay.
And I said, yeah, you're right. I agree.
Yeah. I was also wondering, since we're speaking about your book again, is it translated to other languages? Is it translated to Chinese, Mandarin, and French?
I mean, not at the moment. It will come out in Polish.
In Polish?
Yeah. So translation rights, them being sold is a whole, I feel like it's a whole journey that you don't have so much control over as an author. So, I was kind of surprised that the first offer came from Poland. It would be my dream for it to be translated to Chinese or to French, because my relatives from those two sides of my family, very few speak English. So literally no one can read this book unless it's translated. So there's listeners out there who know publishing houses in those countries or are interested in translation. It's a dream of mine.
And this is what promos are useful for, right? Yeah. Just to get your work out there, and hopefully someone's interested in translating it.
Absolutely.
And why was it that you decided to write in English?
I just didn't feel like my Chinese or my French were up to the level of producing the kind of literary fiction that I wanted to write, because even though they were my native languages, I started going to a fully English education system at the age of 14.
Right.
So the schoolwork I was doing, the university environment I was in, the language that I felt like I was most familiar with in terms of, I know what people are doing in this language in the contemporary literary scene, it was English. And I think as a writer, I wanted to write in the realm that I felt like I know what the standard is. And I think I can at least clear that standard by some level.
Right.
Whereas with Chinese and French, I was less knowledgeable about the contemporary literary scene of those two countries, as I wasn't, I should really be like, I wish I had 3 brains. I know. And 3 times as much time. But I think it would take like going back to one of those countries and living there for a few years, really absorbing what's going on in the literary scene there, building my linguistic skills back up to be like, I have something of equal value to offer.
Yeah. And you don't want to sound outdated, right? With language, it develops over time as well. So whatever, I guess also environment you're in with the language, that's how you can express yourself easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're also reading English books now.
Yeah. So my reading can be a little bit more varied, because I do feel like as a reader, if something is in your native language, it's actually a way to reacquire it. So I haven't read a book in Chinese for a while now, but having spent 3 weeks in China just now, I started just buying stacks of Chinese books and reading them. And I was like, my brain was feeling this excitement of feeling the words kind of reanimating and re-inhabiting my brain. Because a lot of words, it's like, I haven't thought about them in years, but I know them, but I literally wouldn't.
Right.
It's like, they're very faint in my mental vocabulary now, but I'm tracing them over with a strong black Sharpie now that I'm like, I feel this language being reinforced in my brain. And so I love that experience of whenever I go to a country in which I speak or can read that language, I like to try to find books in the original language, and read them while I'm visiting.
Can you share maybe with us, what are these books?
Yeah, so two that really come to mind. One is the poems of Haizi. He was a very prominent Chinese poet, active from the 60s to 89. His life was really, really brief. And then another one is actually an essay collection by a writer called Qing Shan.
Okay.
Who, and a lot of it's like travel writing in Chinese. And I'm editor at Off Assignment, which is actually a magazine in English, but it's really focused on a new form of travel writing, like not just the kind of very colonial, traditional, like old British man goes to the developing world and writes about it from a very, kind of colonial, exoticizing eye. I always say, as an editor of that magazine, all kinds of nationalities of people are constantly traveling everywhere. And yet, mostly we only see, at least in the English language world, like one very thin slice. And we should be publishing more travel writing and translation. So that this essay collection by this one Chinese writer who's traveling to Southeast Asia, and she's making all these observations about, these like white backpackers in the hostel from a Chinese woman's perspective. I thought that was so delicious and hilarious. And I was like, I want this to be translated in English so more Western readers can also expand their view of travel writing as like other people of other races traveling to other countries. And it's not just dominated by this canon.
Yeah, because when I see also foreigners, Chinese tourists, tourists from other countries, I can't help but to think, what are they thinking about? Because obviously I don't speak their language. We can't really communicate. So I'm really curious. And I think since I was a kid, I've been observing tourists as well and always wondered what they're thinking about and how is their experience here. So if I could read some of those, that would be actually really, really interesting. But I've actually never thought about it.
I actually haven't really thought about it in this way until this very moment, but travel writing in translation, right? Like that is such a tool. Yeah, when you're at this touristic site and you wonder, oh, that Chinese tour group or that old, Black couple over there, or that like lone Scandinavian band, we're all at the same, tourist site, but what are our days or our experiences like? And if everyone could, write travel writing in their own native language of their experience, but that translation to be available for us to understand each other's travel experiences, not just those of the people in our social media bubbles in our own language, that would be such like a mind-blowing, interconnected network. Like
discovering a whole new world that we've never been to before.
Yeah,
that would be cool. Okay, I have two more questions. Did you bring anything to read in Bali? And I also, if it's okay to know a little bit more about like your next project or book, that would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I brought The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera because I read it at 17 or 18 and I was not particularly taken by it, but I know it's a book that's so important for so many people. And I think I was too young and haven't lived enough life when I first read it. So I really am not a rewatcher or a rereader of things, but I thought maybe now at 31, this book will hit me a different way because I was too young to really appreciate its philosophies and wisdoms. But my question for you is, what Balinese or Indonesian book would you recommend?
I was going to say I'm also not a rewatcher and a rereader. Someone told me that they read one book 5 times and I was just like, oh my gosh, how could you do that? But anyway, a recommendation for you to read in Bali or maybe after somewhere else about Bali, apart from my mother's book, my mom's memoir, maybe a really good book written about our culture, our traditions, it's called Skala, Niskala, which I will, it's so hard to translate. Something to do with the supernatural belief of Bali and religion and the traditions of Bali. It's not fiction, so it's nonfiction, but I feel like that could give you a really good understanding for Bali.
Is it in
It is in
translation?
English.
Okay.
It's actually written by a foreigner. Bali, Skala, Niskala. Sorry, let's search. Oh no, because my phone is not here. I'm not connected to the internet. But anyway, I'll look it up again later.
Yeah.
So that book. And then can you tell us a little bit about your next project?
What I'm working on next is totally different from my book one.
Or maybe a different approach if you can't tell us. Spoilers, like your next project, how you are approaching your next writing project.
I would say the approach is I tried to plan it all out and that didn't work. So now it's a fever dream approach where I'm just writing, having no idea what the next chapter will be. But I'm calling it a retelling of the picture of Dorian Gray set in a country house in the south of France, featuring a lot of caves and canyons. And yeah, it's my friend's novel. I would say my writing is so place-based. So my first book was so much about China, that part of my, life. And this is essentially taking place, this next book, at my grandparents' house in the French countryside. But was this very kind of surreal, Faustian bargain, kind of conceptual aspect of it. And I'm really challenging myself to embrace the imaginative and the fictional, which, as you know from earlier in our conversation, I started was having like 0% ability or interest in imagining things. And it was all about nonfiction and description. And it was this book. It's really just, I'm currently taking a pause because, I'm in Bali and I want to soak in everything fully, but also I literally have no idea what the next page is going to be, which would have terrified me 5 years ago. I would be like, then my writing project is not working. But now I'm just like, well, maybe this is the enjoyment part of the process where it's like keeping a dream journal and seeing where your subconscious takes you and then molding that material back into a story with a shape.
Right. So you'd say your favorite genre is real fiction, like fiction based on reality or historical fiction. I
would say it's like very descriptive, aesthetically delicate, autofictional literary fiction. If that's a bucket that makes any sense. Yeah, it's oftentimes like the way, when you read something and the way a hyper realistic detail that you might struggle to pinpoint in your own head, it's just, you feel like this really delicate but amorphous feeling has been pinpointed by the writer and expressed exactly with such delicate terms. That's a feeling I love most when I read. And what I just described, like when entire books are doing that, almost every sentence, those are the books I most enjoy reading.
Right. Because I like magical realism because I feel like I'm just amazed to how far our creativity or imagination can stretch.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I will not be able to write that. I feel like I'm drawn to the books I'm not able to write, or I feel like because my imagination seems, at least to me, I'm very hard on myself, limited. So I like to read someone else's work about it.
See, I felt that way before. What you said about, you might not be able to do it. But a little part of me is like, we always surprise ourselves, right? Like
maybe it's a fear. I'm scared to discover myself and my capabilities.
Yeah, and you might surprise yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm interested. I'm very much looking forward to your next novel. And I will also, as soon as I have time, read your first novel. But anyway, thank you so much for being here today. It was a great conversation.